Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, one interesting area here that I've been researching again, of course, in the continuing saga of Bruce Lee. Yes, the continuing saga. And it's interesting that there is still so much interest in all this with someone who made so few films ultimately. So, yet apparently had a huge impact on the world and everything else. And underneath this particular video, there is a link to an interview with the author that kind of sums up Bruce Lee's life and talks about it from a fair viewpoint and really what happened. He even goes into his death, etc. And Matthew Polly is a Bruce Lee fan. And I think that's important as well. The fact that here's a guy who wrote this book, didn't write it as someone trying to make money alone. He did it as a person who was a Kung Fu fanatic. And here's one of the books he wrote, his first book, which is The American Shaolin, where he actually dropped out of Princeton for a few years and went and studied for 2 years at the Shaolin Monastery, paid them $1,300 a month for this privilege, and went through the whole training. And I don't know if he's the first one who did it or not, but I think he is one of the few. But this is a very interesting look into it, and a look into what he did personally, which to me gives him a lot of credit. Now, the problem is anybody can be researchers and authors. One of the things that makes you a really good author or a nonfiction writer is the fact that you were involved in whatever practice you're writing about. And this is exactly what he did. So spending 2 years in a Shaolin monastery learning Kung Fu from the masters is quite exciting. Now, here's his book that goes into that. I'm going to talk about it a little more in terms of this interview that is linked at the bottom here. Here's some pictures of him working out. Now, I'm going to give, I also like to read stuff like this to get a feel for who the author is. I'm a big researcher in terms of who is writing this book. Where are they coming from? That's why I think that the fact that he had this kind of actual training and was immersed in the Chinese culture gives him a insight into things that is much, much higher than anybody else who just does research and tries to figure it out. And, well, yeah, I went to China on a weekend or a holiday and I know it. And this is what so many people do. They make statements of knowing something because they were there. People are involved in a business or they're in the military and they said, yeah, I was stationed. Well, what does that mean? You got to understand that if you're in the military, you live in a really fake world. So you're not really a good a judge. And the military gets most things wrong. Now, if you work for a corporation and you're working in a poor country somewhere, you're going to only associate with the top class of that company. And you're not going to really get a feel for what's going on there. And it also depends on whom and what you are. How interested are you? There's a huge percentage of people, particularly in the military, that never leave the base. They go to the store, buy American foods, go to the American movies, go to the American bowling alleys, and they live in this fake world. And this is particularly true of any place that has huge bases like Germany, with Ramstein having its own mall. Did anybody get that? We're not talking about a couple of stores or even a couple of big stores. You're talking about a giant mall. Things that are being closed down in the rest of the world have opened there. So when you do that, you got to understand. So who is this guy? How can he make? Well, I do have a couple of problems with Polly. But he is a guy who values Bruce Lee and points out his good and bad points, and I like that. He is a fan of Bruce Lee. I like that basically, too, without being Google-eyed like the people I run into so much on YouTube who think he's some sort of a god. Certainly, he was an extremely, and even though I say this, people think I'm attacking him, an extremely talented martial artist. And as Polly points out, he has changed the world, particularly for Asians. He was the first international non-white star, so that's why he's so beloved around the world. He's also a kick-ass. So the male audiences out there want to be like him, and they can relate to him because he ain't John Wayne. So these are the type of things that furthered that, and people love the fact that he went out there and protected the weak and poor, etc. The usual thing that people like, and the usual thing that generated huge amounts of interest with him in the actual box office. And several things come up, but the one problem with Polly is that he's a classical researcher. And that is the fact he looks at the outwardly data. Here's the data, here's a big stack of it. Now, most people who wrote about Bruce Lee, and there hasn't really been a serious biography on him, so Polly states, and I don't think there has been. There's been a lot of kind of lower-level paperback editions, the stuff you read in airport-type books, and I don't think there's been any great research done on him to any great extent. And one of the reasons is because he was kind of not around very long. So he didn't have a big career. And what he did do, he amazingly got enough notice for it, even though they were pretty poor, these Hong Kong films. But he's not looking into anything in the background. So he's not trying to figure out, well, is there something else going on? He also tends to ignore what, and didn't find out about to a large degree past his marijuana use, of how much drugs that Bruce Lee was actually using, which apparently, and I say apparently, was a lot, if we can believe those kind of goofy letters that he talked about taking drugs and committing crimes on his stationery. Huh? So I still have a little problem with that in terms of the Bruce Lee letters, but and are they real or not real? I have no idea. They claim to be authenticated, but there's a lot of money to be made there. I don't know. All of it sounds interesting. And one of the problems is that the Bruce Lee Foundation, his wife, his daughter, wants to keep him enshrined as a squeaky clean person when he wasn't. Not only was he apparently using lots and lots of drugs, particularly marijuana and its derivatives, but was involved in large amounts of cocaine and large amounts of hallucinogens. So, and he was pushing himself to great levels. And you got to remember, he was initially an actor. He made apparently 20 films or so as a child actor, and he was a popular one apparently. And this little link I'm going to give you goes into the basics. So pretty much within 20 or 30 minutes, pretty much half of or even if you want to listen to the whole hour, you get a good feel of the real world that Bruce Lee was living in and what he did. He also did lots of great things, which is this changing of martial arts, because apparently he was a very revolutionary himself. He didn't fit in. People didn't like him because he had European blood in him. It comes per Polly. Once researching his background, he is part Jewish, Dutch Jewish. This stuff that his wife and family were pushing, saying that he was German Catholic, was another ruse. And this is one of the problems we have to understand that, because, the Chinese don't like the Jews any more than the rest of the world's strange hatred for the Jews. So they made up this story again, which is so typical of the Bruce Lee Foundation and those people running it, his wife and his daughter. And he talks about that, as well as how they have squashed any kind of biographies written on Bruce Lee strictly because they didn't fit into, this is a wonderful squeaky clean guy that was born Jesus and died the Buddha. So the whole idea is that this has caused a lot of problems and really hurt Bruce Lee by having him falsely built up. And then when you hear all these stories that come out, it makes him look like a fool. And of course, people as usual, want to have some sort of idol when there are no idols. People are all human, and ultimately you're going to find out that they have all the human problems. They want sex, drug, and rock and roll. They want lots of money. This is what everybody falls into, some lesser and greater. Certainly Bruce Lee fell into that, and all those traps he jumped into. So we're going to go ahead. So the problem with Polly is that while I'm going to give a book review on this book in the future and some comments on it, there's an interesting thing to note on this book as before I go on here. And that is the fact that the pictures here, and this was talked about a little on a Craig Ferguson clip that is on YouTube, the old Craig Ferguson late night talk show where he was a guest on. Matter of fact, he's been around for quite a number of years, Polly, and nobody has ever given him any credit. There are several, it must be 5 to 10 interviews with him on YouTube. And if you're really a Bruce Lee fan, well, listen to this guy, because he's giving what is considered a real point of view. But let's even note on the cover there, that's supposed to be him on the cover. I think it makes him look a little better than he really does look in life. But what do we note about his head here, which is not Shaolin, which is hair. Hair. Now, he stayed there for 2 years. And on the Ferguson show, they talked about him blending in and everything else. Most of these are not him. They're just pictures. They talked about, to a degree, him following their ways, and he did not. He got up in the morning, did his exercise, paid his $1,300 a month, equivalent to $3,000, and you're talking about 20, 30 years ago. So it's equivalent to $3,000, maybe $5,000. That's a fortune back then and with the Shaolin. So they let him in. He was a young guy, didn't give him much credit. But apparently he did excel to some degree, even though he was not a physical person in his life. He basically, from what I can tell, was kind of a rich kid. You don't go to top Ivy League colleges without having money. That is, unless, of course, he seems to have money. And where did the money come from the school as well? And I asked this before in my other talk. Let's even go with the original amount that was paid 30 years ago of $1,300 a month. Could you just do that? Just quit your job, do everything else, and have that at that age? Because he didn't go over there, well, I'm going to save money. Okay? That's still a lot of money a year. So you're talking about $14,000, $15,000, whatever that comes out to be. And if you want to stay there for 2 years, let's just get it down to, let's just round it out at 15 grand. 2 years would be $30,000. Now, this isn't unheard of in this day and age because there tends to be ways to make a fair amount of money relatively quickly. But still, it's a lot of money. If people had to come up with that kind of money right now, no matter what you're doing, you would have to. So he was able to do that. And I'll find out in the book if there's any talk about that. So apparently he had money to do this. But for a guy who wants to inundate himself with the culture, he stated that he did not stay celibate. Now, I'm not sure what he was doing. I don't know if that includes masturbation or not. I don't know if he was out with the locals or not. You have to wonder there, because I would think that would be not part of the actual... that they would allow that at the temple. I mean, general sexuality is not part of the practice. As a matter of fact, you're not supposed to be sexual if you're training in the Shaolin method. And supposedly the Shaolins were where Zen Buddhism came from as well. I wasn't familiar with that statement, but apparently that's what they're saying here as well. But he did not shave his head. So that's like going in the Marine Corps, wanting to becoming a Marine, yet you just keep your long hair. I mean, the first thing the Marine Corps does is cut all your hair off so that you are conforming. Now, he never did that. And I just find that interesting, because who is this Polly guy? Because he's going to make statements and find research interesting and note that fits into it. So he also didn't want to upset anybody by coming out with or talking more about his actual drug use, particularly his harder drug use. He does cover his extensive marijuana use and goes into that with many people who he talked with. But the actual hard drug use, I'm not finished with the book entirely, but it doesn't seem to be mentioned in his original book very much. So he's trying to keep things clean, kind of to not be a attack on Bruce Lee, because of the fact I don't think people are wanting to hear that. And I think he was also afraid to add anything controversial into it. He also goes into the fact that his death was just a physical thing. He was having problems when he was over there. He's linking his death to heat stroke, which I find interesting. And the fact that he had because he was sweating so much on camera, and you got to remember, Bruce Lee, first and foremost, grew up as an actor. So he was very well aware of what he looked at. That was also a master karate person, but he was this little star, and he knew what it looked like in front of the camera. He didn't know too much about the backside of the camera, at least not until very late in his career, where he started to do a little bit of that. But the bottom line is that he was sweating profusely, and he had apparently the sweat glands, which is something that is done, removed from his armpits, so he didn't look so sweaty. This is thought to contribute to the problems that he was having. So he's saying that and he was feeling fairly weak and almost died previous to this last time, where he did die when he was taken to the hospital and given some drugs that apparently saved his life. After that, he went back to his same routine. I'm assuming taking lots, if that's true, lots of cocaine, pushing his body, going through all this, being at the top of his career, and this could have killed him as a reality. He also made some statement on this film that the last thing he was given was an aspirin before he laid down and then never woke up again at his, quote, girlfriend's house. So the bottom line is that Bruce Lee, who was married at the time, was just part of what he was doing. So we all need to understand that this isn't some guy who went out and meditated at the temple and didn't have sex. This was a guy who was very active in all those areas. It's also been noted that he was a fad dieter. He would do anything that came on the scene that helped build muscles or fad diets. And of course, these kind of things tend to be very bad on your body. So, and all this is covered in his book. So anybody who's a Bruce Lee fan should read his book. Not this one. This is about his life and his training. But Bruce Lee, A Life, that he wrote. That is available and on Amazon. You can either get it as a Kindle book, which is read to you, or a physical book that you can read. So you have both ways of doing that. So this is what he said again. Well, I find this very, very hard to believe, a guy who's that fit. But he was really pushing himself. And if he was pushing himself 24/7 using narcotics that he was doing, well, you're really putting your body in a terrible position, even if you are relatively well. There is still slight talk about, there isn't enough talk about the back injury and everything else that was supposed to cripple him. Was he in horrible pain? Was he taking a bunch? Of course, cocaine's not going to help you for the pain that much. But there isn't that much talk about it. But if we are to believe those letters, which are quite incriminating, he's not talking about feeling bad. He's not talking about getting overly involved. He's talking about taking lots of enhancing drugs, making yourself constantly hyped up so you can function all the time. And this is, of course, how you get a lot more done. The problem is it's very hard on your body. And I don't know how much smoking he was doing in terms of marijuana and hashish and other things. This will bring you down. And then, of course, he was taking hallucinogens or whatever benefit that gave him. So he was a great experimenter and looked into everything new and unusual. He did this in all of his life. He was the first person, first Oriental to ever train a black man in martial arts, which was prohibited by the Chinese themselves, which I keep telling people. The Chinese, like everybody else in the world, are very racist in themselves. So he said that he's going to train anybody he wants to. So that was one of his steps. Now, whether he did this to build his schools up or not, I don't know. But he tended to want to open things up because he had a great prejudice against him by the Chinese, who constantly harassed him because he wasn't 100% Chinese, which is kind of laughable. So he was very open to that. He was the first Asian to ever star in a American produced film ever. And that didn't happen again until Jackie Chan repeated that. Another thing I didn't know. I find that fascinating. So that last film of his, which was sponsored by an American and that was helped by American money and productions, that was the first ever that a actual Asian was put. The rest of the Asian stars were all white people with fake eyes on, which was very typical of Hollywood. That didn't even get repeated again, you would think, because martial arts were not big. People were not interested in them as people think. And Kung Fu was a popular TV series that helped move the martial arts craze out there, but it wasn't as big as people think it is. And it was very philosophical. People were looking at the belief systems that was involved in all that. So what does that mean in terms of the bigger picture? Even to this day, martial arts don't have much of a media. There is few movies and virtually no TV shows except one that I'm familiar with, which is The Karate Kid. Where are they if it's so popular? Where are all the movies? Well, they just aren't out there. And the martial arts movies that are made very cheaply and generally have a very small following. And you have to say to yourself, why? But Bruce Lee was responsible for moving martial arts into the major mainstream interest in society. Even though there's a few other things that happened there as well. A lot of karate was coming over because of Elvis Presley and the Japanese influence. You got to remember that after World War II, there was a giant occupation force there. People were coming back from Japan consistently. Military. So they were bringing back all this stuff, and it became very popular. And of course, certainly, we can't underestimate the power of Elvis Presley, because I'm not sure how many people in America were all that crazy about Bruce Lee, even though they want to say it is. Well, I'm not sure that is. When you're talking about a relatively racist white country, I'm sure people respected him, even though I never heard anybody talk about Bruce Lee in my high school or anything else. Nobody was really interested in it. Several people were taking karate, but nobody really talked about Kung Fu and other things. And Kung Fu is a very difficult tradition to learn, forming animal positions. I know I watched many of these down in Los Angeles because I was going to take it at one time. So I'm not going to turn myself into a damn bug. Move like this, the praying mantis positions, the other things, even moving like tigers. This is very difficult, and you really hard to take a human body and make it look like some sort of insect or animal. So I don't remember any of that. But needless to say, he became a worldwide sensation because of his basic race and the fact that people could relate to him around the world. And that's what kind of why there are Bruce Lee posters in Sri Lanka and Buenos Aires. You name it, he is a guy that everybody likes. And he certainly looked the ultimate of cool. And this is what everybody wants to be, the ultimate warrior, the ultimate guy out there looking cool. I've never heard women say that he was attractive or not, but I'm assuming there was that macho image there that women liked as well. So, but getting back to Polly, he is not a great researcher past what's on the top. He's not a guy that's going to keep looking. He's not a guy that apparently is going to ask questions that are difficult to answer. He's not going to look for conclusions past the common. This is the big problem with him. So the whole idea is that with that kind of attitude, and of course being a rich kid or a person going to an Ivy League college, he's used to saying, yeah, ma'am, because that's what you do in colleges. They brainwash you. You're not going to argue with your instructors. Few people do that. So you're conditioned to accept the status quo and what you're looking for generally as a person. And I'm not sure what he was studying there, but what you're looking for when you go to these schools is to agree with your teachers and learn. Now, of course, that's always the first step in learning. It is the first step, though. It's the baby step. What is really going on? When somebody says somebody did this or they were using a lot of marijuana, well, what does that mean? And who were the people he was hanging around with? No, it was just the people of the time. Well, we got to look past that. So his conclusions about his death, he doesn't look into it. Now, Bruce Lee also was working for the rival production company in China and Hong Kong. The number one production studio, which was making a fortune and pretty much ran the business, guess what? He wasn't working for them. They didn't take him on. He was a nobody. So all of a sudden, the studio that isn't doing well, isn't making much money, is getting all the business. See, he doesn't think like a businessman or doesn't think in a bigger picture. Well, the point is Bruce Lee becomes a huge threat to the old production company, the people that were there, the people that were making lots of money, and who would that be? Yeah, the triads. Well, the bottom line is that the triads were run everything as they do today, as all organized crime runs the entire world, no matter what country you're in. So you've got to understand that. So the point is that he was a big threat to the triads. Now, I don't know if he met with the competition or what he did, but the point is that he was working his last movie, and because of his great success in these really bad Hong Kong movies that nobody ever really watched or even cared about, except for film buffs that got a charge out of that. It's like watching old samurai movies and series. You're going to get a very tiny group of people that like that. So the whole idea is that this little studio that was barely surviving has the biggest talent on the planet now, and the other people have nothing. Now, everybody wanted Bruce Lee movies and Bruce Lee. Now, and then, of course, he was working with the actual Americans that were over there helping him produce stuff and working on projects that were involved with the American production. And he was expected to go back to America and try this. And I don't think it would have worked at the time. I think it's illusionary to think that he would have been a big success, even with a well-made film. I think he would have been looked at today as a big success in terms of what a great movie that was. But back then, I don't think it would have made any money in the United States, and I think he would have ended up back in Hong Kong. It's just a fact. It's just not of interest. Martial arts was just getting started. Karate was thought to be better than this kind of goofy kung fu. It was thought to be more serious. It was coming from the Japanese that Americans had more contact with because they were occupying Japan and spending a lot of time there. So I think it's illusionary to think that Kung Fu would have caught on to begin with, or that it's even practiced that much today. It's still kind of an awkward art, and there's an awful lot of martial arts. Who's doing what, where, and what styles, well, who knows? But let's not get too awfully bogged down in that. But as we move into that, we have to understand that. So he doesn't look at these things that could potentially be very serious in what could happen to him. So we have this whole thrown in reality of drug use, substantial drug use of things that really can mess you up, to a guy that may have not been physically that well. Maybe he was taking other things for his bad back. He wanted to look cool, having sweat glands removed in the tropics. You know, Hong Kong is an extremely hot place, so that he looked cooler. And I think that's something to really note there, because that's what he was into. He wanted to look good. Well, you know, that's what the camera is all about, looking good. I think all of that is something that people have to fully understand of what's going on here besides what is so obvious. But we have these health issues. We have someone who has a cocktail of drugs in him. He was apparently a very heavy user of marijuana. We also know that marijuana is relatively inane, but not entirely. People want to say that marijuana is a lot less problematical than it is. There's lots of side effects when using marijuana, including, I've had this myself, of horrible, horrible headaches that last for days. So the whole idea is I'm not the only one. And when I talk to people about marijuana use after using it myself and having problems many years ago, they all have little stories of how they used marijuana and got sick with it, kind of like drunk stories. So it's not what we always think. But it's hard to believe that this would endanger his life, but complicated-wise, maybe it could, but it's unlikely. But if you mix that with a whole bunch of other things and maybe prescription drugs and so forth, well, you're getting this dangerous cocktail that can kill you, possibly. his physical fitness was at a cost. He wanted to look good. I'm not sure he cared about his body. These fad diets he went on and took every possible supplement and other things to look good and build muscles and get rid of fat. All of this stuff he did is generally, when it's done haphazardly, which apparently it was, and he was a fad dietist. He would eat just meat or drink just lots of cow's blood or other things I've heard from different people. And the fact is that this is not good for you. These are not balanced diet. But he wasn't a very balanced guy. So while he wanted to be independent and do what he wanted, he was not a great researcher. And he wasn't spending a lot of time seeking higher wisdom, as a lot of people would think he was doing. Just not true. It's just not the way things were going there, and that's something that everyone should be fully aware of. So was that part of it? Well, I still go back to my original conclusion. This makes it a less of a serious conclusion when you get how potentially sick he was and pushing himself. But he seems to have gone from what is a fairly healthy person. But of course, he was in a very healthy environment kind of at that time, even though Hollywood tends to be drug users again. But because he did get his all of his drugs from a white guy that was living in the Hollywood area, which is interesting, and had that sent to him. And apparently these kind of things weren't readily available in Hong Kong at that time. Apparently they were at the West Coast, though, which is interesting. But he was kind of in a environment where he had to be more controlled. Being in a Western society, you can't act as weird there without being noticed, especially since you're trying to get jobs and everything else. So the whole idea is that when he let go and was this big star and worshipped wherever he went in Hong Kong, he went crazy. And of course, he was an extremist. So he went in with all these fad diets, all these things. He tried every drug he could to find out what value it had. And while he didn't seem to be classically addicted to anything, he certainly was an experimenter. Just as he was fads in diets, he was fads in the drugs. So it does look like there is a leaning towards more, but I don't think the full story is there. This guy threatened the power structure. He was making lots of money for the competition, and that ain't going to be looked on very happily. These triads were losing millions of dollars and were going to lose a lot more. He was staying with his Hollywood buddies and not working with the Chinese people, even though I'm assuming that they were being bought off to some extent. But the point is that's not where it was going. It was going from this big explosion in Hong Kong to a thought that he would be a big star in Hollywood. And that was their assumption from Hong Kong. I don't believe that to be the truth, but if that would have happened in terms of something being a great hit or not, I think he would have established himself as a momentous international star, and that may have carried him on with quality Hollywood films, but we just don't know. So, I mean, that's the real story. I will get back to you on this, but, Polly is not a guy who's looking for dirt. He's uncovering, blowing the dust off of known facts. He is a person who wants to do his own thing, has his own reality, and the fact that he didn't shave his head, he didn't stay celibate, he didn't do all the things that he should have to follow the system properly. This shows me somebody who lacks a certain dedication ultimately and has a hidden personal agenda. So he didn't feel he needed all that, and maybe he's right in that. I'm the kind of person that tends to do the same thing. I'm not sure that shaving your head is anything when you're a short-termer, if that's going to help your Kung Fu. I don't think it helps your Kung Fu at all. And I don't think you should try and be something you're not. You're not a Chinese monk. Do you need to shave your head? But it just shows me that that's what he was doing, and in terms of an attitude. And how he was actually functioning. So what does that mean in the bigger picture? But he comes up with some very simple conclusions that are a little bit too simple. And the fact that he's not digging deep. He's not looking for potential problems. What's happening there? What about the triads? What about the other things going on? And just kind of ignores these things. He also apparently is not really getting into severe drug use, which was apparently part of what's going on. So all of this he didn't really get heavily into or uncover. And the fact is that he died from heat stroke because he didn't release enough of energy because he had his sweat glands underneath his arms removed. Well, I mean, it sounds logical, doesn't it? But, you sweat in a lot of other areas too, but could in this particular environment, could that toxify the body and lead to heat stroke? Well, it certainly could, especially if your body's all pumped up on cocaine and your body's working 3 times harder than it normally does, and it can't get rid of wastes and water pressure like it needs to. So what happens is that you get swelling of the brain because you've got too much water in your system. Certainly makes sense. Is that the answer? Well, as with all these things, it is certainly an interesting story, and I don't think we're going to get a quick answer to any of this. You can't trust any police reports. Whatever the coroner said is just as good as toilet paper because he's going to write what the people in power tell him to write. We do know there was massive, as there still is today, massive police corruption in Hong Kong where people were making tens of thousands of dollars a month. So the whole idea is whatever had to clean up that case to get rid of this punk who wouldn't go along with the triads is how things really work. And people don't want to face this because it's that unknown. They also tend to do this generationally. The actual organized crime will harass you for years and years and even go after your family. So the weird case of Brandon Lee with that very strange, sloppy, and criminal activity that armorer did on the actual set of The Crow is highly suspicious that you could possibly be that sloppy with your work, and doesn't add up to being sloppy, particularly for a gun handler who didn't clean his guns and get them ready for the next day. Why? Why was something stuck in the barrel? One of the problems with shooting particularly blank rounds is that they're overloaded with what is considered gunpowder. So you want to clean your guns even more. So this doesn't make sense, and the fact that nothing was followed through, that your typical corrupt police work was done, all has a great suspicion of that this is a carry-on, and that's what happens. Just like with the Kennedys, the actual family, after Robert Kennedy was killed because of his involvement with and traitoring, basically the mafia, and probably wasn't well liked in other places, they not only killed him, but they killed his brother. And I believe even his grandson, was it his son was killed in that bizarre plane accident that this guy took off in horrible weather and killed himself and a few other relatives? Well, how strange is that? Yet again, that kind of fits in. You're an unexperienced flyer and you're flying around in horrible fogs and so forth. Well, this can be very dangerous. But here we go again. Why does it happen like this? It's very, very strange. And if you think it's just straightforward, just the way it is, well, I think you're being highly naive. Life is all about the occult, the hidden. What's really going on? Who has the power? Who doesn't have the power? And how do you find out? And how do you access that power? Until next time.